Major Bruce Crandall held his UH-1 Huey on the ground at landing zone X-ray. Rotor blades still turning, enemy fire cracking against the airframe from 3 directions at once. His helicopter carried no weapons of its own. Nothing but a crew chief's door gun, and whatever courage kept a pilot's hands steady on the controls while 3 of his own soldiers lay dead in the cabin behind him, and 3 more bled from wounds that would kill them if this aircraft didn't get off the ground in the next few seconds. Crandall did not lift off. He held the Huey steady in a landing zone still under fire, waiting the extra seconds it took for 4 more wounded men to be loaded aboard. Extra seconds that could have cost him the aircraft, the crew, and his own life. It was, he said decades later, the longest day he ever experienced in any aircraft. To understand how an unarmed, thin-skinned utility helicopter became the single machine most responsible for how the entire Vietnam War was fought, resupplied, and survived, we have to go back to a 1952 Army requirement that had nothing to do with combat rescue at all. In 1952, the U.S. Army issued a specification for a new helicopter intended primarily for medical evacuation, training, and general utility work, a replacement for the aging piston-engine helicopters that had proven themselves during the Korean War, but were already showing their age. 20 companies submitted competing designs. Bell Helicopter's Model 204 won the contract in late 1953, and its first prototype, designated the XH-40, flew for the first time on October 20th, 1956, at Fort Worth, Texas. Bell's design used something none of its Korean War predecessors had, a gas turbine engine rather than a piston engine, a choice that gave the new aircraft dramatically better performance at altitude and in hot weather. Exactly the conditions Vietnam would eventually demand of it. The Army designated the production aircraft the UH-1 Iroquois. Soldiers, unable to resist the obvious wordplay on that designation, started calling it the Huey almost immediately, and the nickname outlasted the official name by decades. The first Hueys arrived in Vietnam in 1962, initially with the 57th Medical Detachment, flying under the call sign that would become synonymous with helicopter medical evacuation for the rest of the war. Dust off. But the Army's ambitions for the aircraft expanded rapidly as the ground war escalated. By 1963, emerging air mobility doctrine envisioned the Huey doing far more than ferrying wounded soldiers to field hospitals. It would carry entire infantry units directly into contested landing zones, haul artillery pieces and ammunition, fly reconnaissance and psychological warfare missions, and when fitted with rocket pods and machine guns, provide direct fire support of its own. When the newly activated 1st Cavalry Division, redesignated airmobile specifically to reflect its total dependence on helicopter mobility, deployed to Vietnam in the late summer of 1965, it brought 435 helicopters with it, the overwhelming majority of them Hueys, concentrated at a forward base called An Cay that briefly represented the largest single concentration of helicopters ever assembled in the history of warfare. A hovering helicopter, whether delivering troops or extracting wounded, represented the single most vulnerable moment of any mission, forced to hold a fixed position directly over ground that might be crawling with enemy riflemen, while it slowed nearly to a stop. Dr. Gunners, positioned at open bays on either side of the cabin, carried the entire burden of covering that vulnerable window, firing handheld M60 machine guns outward in whatever direction fire seemed heaviest, while the pilots focused entirely on holding the aircraft steady. No crew flew without one, and the position carried a grim reputation of its own among the men who filled it, since a door gunner's exposure to incoming fire during a hover often exceeded that of the infantry he was covering. That concentration of aircraft got its first real test barely 3 months later, in a remote valley near the Cambodian border that most of the men flying into it had never heard of before their mission briefing. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, was ordered into an air assault against suspected North Vietnamese positions in the Ia Drang Valley. At 10:48 in the morning, on November 14, 1965, UH-1B helicopters delivered the first wave of Moore's battalion into a small clearing designated Landing Zone X-ray. Within hours, North Vietnam's 33rd Regiment attacked in force, triggering the first major battle of the entire war between American ground forces and a regular North Vietnamese army unit, a battle later immortalized in the book and film We Were Soldiers. What happened in the skies above X-ray over the following 3 days demonstrated something American military planners had theorized about for years but never actually tested against a determined, well-armed enemy. That a helicopter-borne force, resupplied and reinforced entirely by air, could sustain and eventually win a battle against a numerically superior, dug-in opponent operating far from any resupply of its own. 59 helicopters sustained damage over the course of the fighting at X-ray. Only 4 were shot down outright, and 3 of those were recovered. Given the volume of fire directed at aircraft that had to slow to a hover directly over an active battlefield to deliver troops or extract wounded, those numbers represented something close to a vindication of the entire airmobile concept. Crandall's actions on November 14th became the single most cited example of what that vindication actually cost the men flying the missions. Commanding Company A, 229th Assault Helicopter Battalion, Crandall led the first major airmobile troop insertion of the entire battle into X-ray. After several routine lifts delivered troops without incident, the landing zone turned hot. On his next flight in, 3 soldiers aboard his aircraft were killed and 3 more wounded before the Huey ever touched down. Rather than abort the mission, Crandall held the aircraft on the ground under continuing fire long enough for 4 wounded men to be loaded aboard for evacuation. He and fellow pilot Captain Ed Freeman went on to fly repeated unarmed resupply and medevac runs into the same landing zone throughout the battle, carrying ammunition and water in on flights that had no fighter escort and no guarantee the landing zone would still be in friendly hands by the time they arrived. Both men received the Medal of Honor decades later, in 2007 and 2001 respectively, for actions that at the time were treated as simply what the mission required. The aircraft that made those missions possible was never designed with anything like Ia Drang in mind. A standard UH-1D could carry a flight crew and roughly a dozen additional passengers, or just under 3,900 pounds of cargo inside the cabin, nearly 5,000 pounds if slung externally beneath the airframe. It carried light armor at best, none at all in its earliest configurations, and depended on door gunners firing handheld M60 machine guns from open bays on either side of the cabin for whatever defensive fire it could return while making its approach into a landing zone. Pilots and crews universally rated the survival odds of flying Hueys in Vietnam at roughly half that of an ordinary infantryman on the ground, and North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units learned specific tactics built entirely around that vulnerability, on occasion deliberately sparing wounded American soldiers on the ground purely to lure in the medevac helicopter that would inevitably come for them, and shooting at that instead. The variant Vietnam crews came to know as the Hog carried a very different profile from the unarmed transport aircraft, called the Slick precisely because its smooth sides carried no visible weapon pods. Armed UH-1B and UH-1C gunships mounted rocket pods, M60 machine guns and later the multi-barrel M134 minigun, providing suppressive fire directly onto landing zones as troop-carrying Slicks made their approach. Air cavalry troops eventually organized these aircraft into color-coded teams working in coordinated sequence. White teams flying small observation helicopters to locate the enemy, red teams of armed Hueys engaging what the scouts found, and blue teams of unarmed Slicks delivering ground troops once the landing zone had been suppressed. It was, in effect, a complete miniature combined arms battle fought entirely through the medium of helicopter aviation, coordinated in real time over a single radio net. This is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to dig up. The aircraft behind the sound everyone remembers. If that's why you're still here, you already know what to do before the next one goes up. Across the full span of the war, Hueys of every configuration logged more than 10 million flight hours and, by some tallies, over 30 million individual sorties, a volume of helicopter activity so unprecedented that veterans and historians alike began referring to Vietnam simply as the helicopter war. The distinctive low thump of an approaching Huey's rotor blades, audible from a considerable distance in open terrain, became one of the most recognizable sounds of the entire conflict, capable of signaling relief to a besieged American unit and dread to a North Vietnamese force that had learned exactly what usually followed that sound within minutes. By the war's end, more than 8,000 Hueys had been built, over 7,000 of which served at some point in Vietnam, and nearly 3,000 of which were lost to combat and operational causes combined. They evacuated more than 120,000 wounded soldiers under the dust-off call sign alone. A medical evacuation system so effective that a wounded American reaching a hospital anywhere in Vietnam had, by most measures, better odds of survival than a wounded soldier in any previous American war. Purely because the average interval between being hit and reaching a surgical table had collapsed to well under an hour in most cases. More than 10 recipients of the Medal of Honor earned that decoration specifically flying helicopter medevac missions into landing zones under fire. Missions that carried no weapons of their own and no guarantee the aircraft would still be intact by the time the wounded were finally aboard. Ground crews and maintenance battalions across Vietnam kept that entire system running under conditions the aircraft's original 1952 specification had never anticipated. Monsoon humidity that corroded electrical systems within weeks. Dust and grit that accelerated engine wear far beyond peacetime maintenance schedules. And combat damage that arrived on a near-daily basis for many units. UH, returning from a single mission with over 100 bullet holes, was not unusual enough to ground an aircraft permanently. Crew chiefs patched what they could overnight and sent the same airframe back out at first light, because the war's daily tempo of resupply, reinforcement, and medevac simply did not allow for extended downtime on any single aircraft the mission depended on. The Huey's dominance did not go entirely unanswered as the war progressed. North Vietnamese anti-aircraft defenses grew steadily more sophisticated through the late 1960s, and by 1967, the increasing sophistication of that ground fire made continued use of lightly armed UH-1B and UH-1C gunships increasingly costly, prompting the Army to begin transitioning gunship duties to the purpose-built UH-1 Cobra attack helicopter, a dedicated successor that retained much of the Huey's mechanical lineage while carrying far heavier armor and weaponry. The slick and dust-off missions that had defined the Huey's original role, however, remained squarely its own for the remainder of American involvement in the war, since nothing else in the inventory matched its combination of cabin space, reliability, and sheer numbers in theater. Crandall's own verdict on the aircraft, delivered decades after Ia Drang and after receiving the nation's highest military decoration for what he did in that landing zone, needed no elaboration. The Huey, he said, was the best helicopter ever made. Not because it was armored or fast or difficult to shoot down, since by any of those measures, it was none of those things. Because it kept coming back into landing zones that every tactical calculation said it shouldn't. Again and again, for as long as there were wounded men still waiting for it, until an entire war became defined by the specific, unmistakable sound of its rotor blades arriving overhead exactly when it mattered most.